Thank you for being here with me today. Stories like this one aren't just tales. They are mirrors. Sometimes they reflect our wounds, sometimes our healing. If you're new, I'd be grateful if you joined our little circle by subscribing. We tell stories of family, of sacrifice, of respect. And tonight I'll share with you something very close to my heart. The story is called My Daughter-in-Law Tried to Slip Something into My Wine, so I swapped the glass. It began as so many family stories do around a dinner table. The air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey, baked bread still warm, and the faint sweetness of wine waiting to be poured. Candles flickered along the polished oak, casting shadows across faces I once believed were bound by love and respect. I sat at the head of the table as I always had. My name is Max. I am not a man of wealth or fame, just a father now in his late 50s, with silver beginning to show at my temples and lines carved deep from years of labor. My wife used to tease me, saying each line on my face was a story. Tonight, one of those lines deepened. The clinking of glasses rose in the room as someone called for a toast. It was a moment that used to bring me pride, a father lifting his glass with his family around him, voices, overlapping laughter spilling like music. But as I reached for my glass, I noticed movement at the corner of my eye. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, her smile thin, her hand careful as she hovered near my place setting. And then, with the smallest tilt of her wrist, something slipped into my wine. A ripple disturbed the surface of the red liquid. I froze. For a heartbeat, the entire room felt suspended. The laughter dulled, the candles hissed, and the scent of roasted meat turned bitter in my nose. She looked up at me with eyes that dared me to notice. And I thought this wasn't just a toast anymore. This was a test. I kept my hand steady on the stem of the wine glass, though inside my pulse hammered louder than the clinking forks and chatter around me. Years in the factory had taught me to hold steady under pressure. But this was my own table, my own family, and the betrayal stung deeper than any hardship at work. I let my eyes wander as if admiring the candlelight. But really, I was searching faces. My son leaned back in his chair, laughing too loudly at a cousin's joke. He didn't see what had just happened, or maybe he didn't want to. Around the table, plates of steaming food were passed, the scent of butter and garlic rising, yet I could hardly breathe. I studied the glass again. The surface had settled, the wine dark and still, but I knew. I had seen it. That deliberate flick of her hand, the quick withdrawal, the smug curve at the corner of her lips. I thought back to all the nights I worked overtime to make sure this family never lacked hands blistered, shirt damp, with sweat shoulders aching. Every penny saved, every sacrifice made had been poured into building a home where respect should live. And now, in the quiet rebellion of a single act, I saw how fragile that respect had become. I heard her voice, then soft but edged with steel. "Go on, Dad, raise the toast. We're all waiting." The room fell quiet, the kind of hush that feels like everyone is watching for a slip, a stumble. Her words pressed against me, a challenge cloaked in politeness. I lifted the glass slightly, just enough to let the candlelight catch its surface. The ruby liquid shimmered like a secret. My reflection stared back, faintly older line, tired but not blind. I smiled, faint and measured, and set the glass back down. No one noticed, or perhaps they pretended not to. But in that moment I made a silent vow, whatever game she thought she was playing, it would not be mine to lose. The glass sat before me like a loaded question. The silverware clinked, chairs scraped, laughter picked up again, but beneath it all ran a current only I could feel. My daughter-in-law's eyes darted to the glass, then away quick as a knife pulled back before anyone saw the flash. I leaned back slightly, letting the wooden chair creak under my weight. The sound broke the rhythm of the table, a tiny fracture in the harmony of the evening. I remembered other nights years ago when that same chair had held me after 12-hour shifts at the factory oil, still on my hand shirt, clinging with sweat, my wife setting down a plate of stew without a word. She would look at me, and I'd know sacrifice was our second language. Now, in that same chair, I faced the betrayal that came not from strangers but from blood tied to me by marriage. A cousin raised his glass, oblivious. To family he cheered. The chorus followed, voices overlapping, some strong, some half-hearted. I lifted my hand but let it hover over the stem. My hesitation caught her eye. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped, her smile too sharp, her gaze too expectant. Echoes pressed against me, the sound of machines from the factory floor. The thud of my boots crossing concrete, the clatter of coins counted carefully at the kitchen table. And now this soft clink of crystal turned weapon by the smallest drop, unseen. I rotated the angle of my gaze, letting it drift across the table. My son caught my eye for a moment. His laugh froze just a flicker. Then he looked away, raising his own glass high. Did he know, or was he too blind, too wrapped in pride to see the shadow in his own house? I steadied my breath, letting silence spread in the cracks of their laughter. That silence was mine, and in it I made another vow, not just to endure, but to turn this act back on itself. The glass no longer looked like a trap. It looked like a mirror waiting to show her reflection when the moment came. I let the glass sit, untouched, the red wine catching the shimmer of chandelier light. From the corner of my eye, her fingers twitched against the napkin in her lap, small, impatient movements, as though willing me to drink. The sound of forks and knives grew louder, sharper than before, every scrape across porcelain ringing, like a bell of warning. I leaned back, allowing the chair's wood to groan under my weight, a sound too ordinary for anyone else, but to me, it felt like the echo of another night long ago. I saw my wife, apron dusted with flour, coaxing me to the table after another day at the factory. She would press a bowl into my hands, whispering, "Eat first, talk later." Sacrifice, then, was simple, sacred. Food carried love, not schemes. Now Betrayal sat across from me, wrapped in silk and perfume, her smile painted too carefully. She touched her husband's arm, my son's arm, and he smiled back, blind pride radiating from him. I caught that smile and remembered the mornings I carried him on my shoulders through winter wind, his small hands clutching my hair, his laughter warming my ears when my body ached from labor. That same boy now leaned into the shadow of a woman plotting with crystal and poison. A cousin spoke too loudly, his laugh spilling over the table. "Max, you're too quiet tonight. Raise your glass. This is your celebration after all." The words struck like a hammer against thin glass. My hand moved deliberate, reaching for the stem. Every eye turned expectation, heavy in the air. Her breath caught. I heard it faint as the sigh of a match about to flare. But I paused, let my fingers rest lightly, not lifting yet. I wanted them to feel the silence. I wanted them to hear the weight of it, heavier than their laughter, heavier than any toast. The chandelier hummed faintly, its bulbs buzzing against silence. I shifted my angle, eyes sweeping the table. To one side, my brother-in-law leaned forward, curiosity flickering. To the other, Mies whispered, not knowing she whispered too loud. The family's gaze circled me like a slow, tightening rope. I let my lips curl into the ghost of a smile. Inside, my heart thudded steady, not with fear, but with memory, every sacrifice, every late night, every calloused hand that built this family's table now being mocked by a hidden hand. And as I let my hand hover over the glass, I whispered within myself, "Not yet. Let them wait. Let them watch." The night stretched, the tension taut, as a violin string about to snap. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for the glass to rise, waiting for me to drink. The stem felt cold beneath my fingertips, slick with a faint trace of condensation. It wasn't the chill of wine, it was the chill of mistrust seeping into my veins. I told myself, "Hold steady. Don't show the storm inside." My son leaned in, his voice low but sharp enough for me to hear. "Go on, Dad. Make the toast. Don't leave everyone hanging." He smiled at the others as if this was all harmless delay. But I knew his smile, too practiced, too quick. I remembered another smile years back when I gave him his first work gloves at the factory. They were too big for his hands, the leather folding awkwardly, but he wore them proudly. He had looked at me with gratitude then. Tonight that gratitude was gone. Betrayal had replaced it, seated beside him, wearing earrings that glittered like blades. My daughter-in-law shifted her fingers, brushing the rim of her own glass. Too smooth, too rehearsed. She wanted me to drink. I could almost hear her pulse in the silence. I turned the glass slightly, watching the crimson swirl under the light. It looked less like wine and more like blood, thicker, heavier, something that demanded reckoning. A whisper from the far end of the table reached me. Why is he hesitating? Because I know I thought. Because I see what you think I don't. The clink of silverware quieted. Even the chandelier above seemed to dim shadows stretching across their faces, long and wavering. My heart was steady, but my hands, it was as though they carried the memory of every hour worked, every sacrifice made, trembling not with fear, but with the weight of truth pressing to the surface. I drew a breath slow and deliberate, the kind of breath you take when you are about to speak a truth no one wants to hear. And as I looked at the glass, I thought, this isn't just wine. This is the line they crossed. And if I raise it now, it won't be in their game. It will be in mine. The silence grew unbearable. Someone coughed. Someone else laughed nervously. The table, once filled with chatter, now waited on a single movement of my hand. I let the stem slip from my fingers. The glass stayed on the table untouched, and I looked straight at her. She froze. No one spoke at first. The air in the dining room thickened, as though even the walls knew something had shifted. My fingers, now free of the glass, rested against the wooden table. The wood was warm from the glow of candles, but my palm felt icy. I heard the scrape of a chair leg on the polished floor. My nephew leaned back, whispering, "Is he all right?" His voice was small, almost swallowed by the silence. Across from him, my niece nervously tapped her fork against her plate, a soft metallic rhythm that broke and echoed, broke and echoed. I kept my eyes locked on her, my daughter-in-law. She had always been quick with words, quick with charm. But tonight, her face betrayed her. She smiled, yes, but it was too tight, and her hand lingered just a second too long on the stem of her own glass, as though guarding a secret. I remembered another dinner years ago. My wife was still alive then. She had lit the same candles, their wax dripping, slowly perfuming the room with lavender. My daughter-in-law had been there too, still new to the family. Back then, she laughed easily, leaned in to help with dishes, called me Dad without hesitation. That memory was a gift of light. Now it twisted against this darkness, betrayal, cutting through it like a knife. "Dad," my son said suddenly, his tone clipped. "Why aren't you drinking? Everyone's waiting." The pressure of his stare burned hotter than the candle flame. Around the table I felt the weight of other eyes, expectant, uneasy, some confused. It was like standing on a stage with no script, but knowing the audience was waiting for a revelation. I lifted the glass again, slowly letting the red liquid tilt and catch the light. The room seemed to lean forward with it. And then I set it back down. Harder this time. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. A few people flinched. My nephew dropped his fork. My daughter-in-law's smile flickered like a mask about to split. I looked around the table, one face to the next, and finally spoke, my voice steady. "A toast isn't about the wine. It's about truth. And before I drink, there's something all of you should know." The chandelier above swayed slightly, crystal drops, clinking like distant bells. And in that uneasy music I could see their fear taking root. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the faint tick of the clock in the hallway, each second driving deeper into the room like a nail. I let the moment breathe, let them feel the weight of something unspoken hovering above the table. My son shifted first. "Dad, this is ridiculous," he said, his voice impatient. He tried to laugh, but the sound broke, halfway brittle as glass. "It's just a toast." But I wasn't looking at him. My eyes stayed fixed on her, my daughter-in-law. Her fingers were tapping against her plate, now quick, nervous beats like a bird trapped in a cage. I saw her glance at the glass, then away, then back again, as though the wine itself carried her guilt. In that instant, memory rose sharp as vinegar. Years ago, when my wife was fading in the hospital, it was this same woman who promised me she'd take care of the family. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll honor her place." Her words had been warm, like a hand resting gently on my shoulder. That night, I had believed her. That trust, that sacrifice of hope now felt like ashes in my mouth. I leaned forward, both palms flat on the table. The wood hummed with the pressure. My voice dropped low, steady, every syllable cutting like the edge of a blade. "This family is not built on wine. It is built on trust." And tonight, I felt that trust crack. Around me, the angle shifted the nephew, leaning in the niece, frozen mid-breath, the chandelier casting shadows across worried faces. Echo, and break the memory of her soft promise against the sharp fracture of her silence now. She tried to recover. "You're imagining things," she said, quickly forcing her voice into a brittle calm. "You always imagine things when you feel old." The word landed like a slap. Old? My son lowered his head, not defending me, not correcting her. That betrayal cut deeper than her words. I stood. The chair legs scraped against the floor with a harsh screech. Every eye followed me, the room holding its breath. I lifted the glass high, not to drink, but to show it. The candlelight passed through it, red streaks spilling across the table like bloodlines. I could feel their unease spread like smoke filling the room. And in that haze I spoke with clarity, each word a strike. This glass was not mine to fear. It was hers to answer for. The mask slipped then. I saw her jaw tighten, her smile vanish, her knuckles blanch against the stem of her glass. The truth had not been spoken yet, but it was already circling her like wolves at the edge of firelight. And I knew this dinner was no longer just about a toast. It was about a reckoning. The air felt charged like a storm pressing against the windows, though the night outside was calm. My hand still held the glass aloft the wine, catching the light like a secret waiting to spill. The silence around the table was no longer just tense. It was suffocating every breath, measured every heartbeat too loud. I lowered the glass slowly, my eyes not leaving hers. She shifted in her chair, lips pressed tight, the kind of silence that screamed louder than words. My son tried to break it with a weak smile. "Dad, you're making too much of this." I cut him off by raising my other hand. A pause. Then, with a calmness I didn't feel, I set the glass back down, not in front of me, but directly in front of her. The clink of crystal against the wood was sharp, final, like a gavel falling. A murmur rippled across the table. Someone's fork slipped from their hand, striking the plate with a metallic ping. All eyes turned to her. She froze, staring at the glass as though it had grown teeth. In that moment, I let the memory return, the echo of my wife's laughter, filling this same dining room years ago. Her gentle reminder, trust is fragile, Max. It breaks easier than glass. The echo pressed against the break of tonight, my daughter-in-law's hand, twitching just inches from the stem of the glass she never intended to drink. I leaned in, my voice steady, low enough that it forced everyone to listen. "A toast," I said. "To family." Her eyes widened. She looked at my son, at the others searching for rescue. None came. Even he stayed quiet, his face drained of color, as though some part of him finally understood what was unfolding. She lifted the glass with a trembling hand. The rim brushed her lips, but she hesitated, the room waiting, watching, the silence turning cruel. I saw her eyes flick to me, pleading, desperate, but I did not move. I spoke again, firmer now. "Drink." And in that instant, the fey-age shattered. She slammed the glass back down, wine spilling across the tablecloth, like spilled secrets, crimson bleeding into white. Gasps erupted. Chairs scraped back. The truth had not been confessed aloud, but it no longer needed to be. Her face twisted, the mask gone. "You don't know what you're doing?" she spat, her voice cracking under the weight of exposure. But I did know, and so did everyone else. The dinner had begun with a toast. Now it had become a trial. The wine spread across the white cloth like a wound that refused to close, its edges creeping wider with every second of silence. My daughter-in-law's hand hovered above the stain, as if she could undo what she had revealed, but the trembling of her fingers betrayed her. I looked at her, and then at my son. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted between me and the glass, searching for an explanation that no longer existed. The others shifted in their seats, the scrape of wood against tile echoing like whispers in a church. "You planned this," I said, my voice cutting through the air, neither raised nor trembling, but steady like the hum of a machine that could not be stopped. "In my house, at this table, you tried to turn trust into poison." The words landed heavy. I saw her flinch, her face flushing red, then draining pale. She tried to muster a defense, her lips parting, but no words came. My son spoke instead, his tone brittle. Dad, it's not what it looks like, but I leaned forward, my hands pressing against the table, the knuckles pale under the weight of years and betrayal. It looks exactly like what it is, I answered. The room seemed to close in around us. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, each second a reminder that the truth had finally arrived. My younger relatives, once eager for food and laughter, sat frozen, their eyes wide, their forks abandoned. She finally broke, her voice shrill. You think you're some kind of saint sitting there with your judging eyes? Maybe you don't deserve this family's respect. The words cracked in the air like glass shattering, but they rang hollow. Everyone had seen her hand, her hesitation, her collapse under the weight of my command. I turned my gaze slowly around the table, locking eyes with each person, one by one. No one spoke. No one defended her. The silence was its own verdict. And then I looked back at her. Respect is not demanded, I said, my voice low but firm. It is lived. Tonight you buried your own. The echo of her earlier act still hung between us, the tilt of her wrist, the red liquid swirling, the mask slipping. And with that echo came the break. Her plan turned against her. Her power dissolved under the watch of every pair of eyes. The dinner was no longer a gathering. It had become Judgment Day. The silence broke not with reason, but with fire. My son slammed his hand on the table, the wine glasses rattling silverware, clinking like restless nerves. Enough, he shouted, his face flushed with anger. You're twisting this. She made a mistake. Don't turn it into a spectacle. But it already was a spectacle. The air quivered with what everyone had seen. I could hear the faint whistle of the heater, the buzz of the chandelier, and beneath it all, the uneven breath of those caught between blood and truth. I turned to him, my own son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders through the factory floor when the smell of oil and the rhythm of machines were his lullaby. A mistake, I repeated, my voice steady, my eyes locked on his. A mistake is forgetting salt in the bread. A mistake is breaking a plate. But to reach for poison in your father's cup, that is no mistake. Gasps spread like ripples. A niece covered her mouth with her hand. The old clock in the hall struck its chime, the note dragging through the tension like a witness unwilling to stay silent. My daughter-in-law's face contorted a mix of defiance and panic. You think everyone worships you, but you're old, stubborn, living in the past? Maybe it's time the head of this family changed. Her words pierced deeper than the act itself. I felt the sting, the echo of all the nights I had stood by the fire counting coins, working hours long past midnight to keep this family afloat. The break came sharp, my sacrifices, their contempt. You speak of change, I said, my voice dropping lower, carrying weight rather than volume. But change that begins with betrayal is nothing but rot. The younger cousins whispered, their eyes darting, their chairs creaking, as if even wood itself couldn't stay still under the pressure. One of them muttered, She really did it, we all saw. The rotation of eyes circled back to me, waiting, questioning if I would shatter or stand. And I stood my chair scraping against the floor, the sound raw and final. I lifted my untouched glass, still marked by her hesitation, and set it down again with purpose. This family has always been bound not by wine, not by show, but by trust, I said. Tonight that trust was broken, and all of you must decide what side of the fracture you will stand on. The words hung heavier than any toast, sharper than any accusation. The night no longer belonged to celebration. It belonged to truth, and the hall itself seemed to breathe differently, as if the walls had heard enough to judge for themselves. The echo of my words still clung to the air, sharp and immovable. My son's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his side. He tried to steady his voice, but the tremor betrayed him. You're overreacting, Dad. You always think the worst. She didn't mean anything by it. I leaned forward, my palms flat against the table, the wood cool beneath my hands. The candles flickered shadows dancing on the walls as if the house itself leaned closer to listen. Do not tell me what I saw with my own eyes, I said. Do not ask me to blind myself for your comfort. The break in rhythm came when an older cousin, usually quiet, rose from his chair. His voice cracked, but his words were steady. We saw it too. She tilted the bottle, poured into his glass. That wasn't clumsy. His admission cut through the murmurs like a knife. My daughter-in-law whipped her head toward him, her eyes burning. You're twisting things you've always envied us. Don't think you can turn this against me. The table fractured further. Voices rose in layers, some defending or others whispering their disgust. Chairs, scraped glasses shook. It was no longer one conversation, but many overlapping, colliding, each one carrying the weight of judgment. I sat back, letting the storm swell. Then I rose. The shift in angles was deliberate, from the father accused to the patriarch reclaiming ground. My voice carried not in volume, but in gravity. This family once stood on sacrifice. Bread earned from sweat. Warmth paid for by long nights. Do you remember who kept the lights burning when storms cut the wires, who sold his tools to pay for your schooling? My eyes moved across them, each face a reflection of what had been taken for granted. Echo and break silence followed. Then her voice lashed out again. And you think that gives you the right to rule us forever? You think your suffering makes you king? I turned toward her fully. Now and for the first time I shifted to the first person, letting the weight of memory anchor my words. I never wanted to be king. I only wanted to be father. But tonight when you reached for my glass, you crowned yourself with betrayal. The words landed heavy, and in that silence, a photo frame rattled against the wall from the vibration of voices stilled too suddenly. My late wife's picture sat on the sideboard, her eyes in the photo calm and knowing. I caught sight of it, and I felt her watching, as if reminding me the truth must stand. The hall inhaled as one, the storm frozen, waiting for the next crack of thunder. The silence after my words hung thick, broken only by the faint crackle of the candles and the clink of a nervous hand against a fork. Then, as if the pause had granted them permission, voices erupted, each sharp, each insistent, each dragging the table deeper into fracture. She wouldn't do that, not on purpose, one nephew barked, pounding his fist. His voice shook, not from anger alone, but from fear of what it meant if I was right. Open your eyes, another relative snapped, standing so fast the chair leg scraped the floor. We all saw her lean. We all saw the liquid move. Don't play blind just because it's easier. Echo and break the table became a battlefield of words, and I stood in the center, not raising my voice, but letting theirs consume one another. The rhythm of their accusations collided, swelled, then broke into ragged silence again. That was when my son rose. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight, but his shoulders squared as though he could still command the room. Enough, he said loud enough to silence even the whispers. His eyes locked on me. You don't understand. You never have. You think this family owes you everything because you worked your hands raw. But maybe it's time someone else takes control. Maybe it's time the old ways end. I felt the shift, the arc tightening around us both. A father and son, the table now only a stage for their clash. My hand brushed the rim of my glass, the cool crystal trembling beneath my touch. My wife's picture glinted behind me, its frame catching candlelight. A symbol quiet but unyielding, the memory of sacrifice, the love that had once bound us all. I stepped into the first person, because the weight could not be shared through distance. I bled for this family. Every scar on these hands was a prayer for your future. I never asked you to repay me, only to protect what was sacred: trust, respect, and love at this table. And tonight you tried to poison it all. The room gasped, some literally covering their mouths. My son staggered back a step, his jaw unhinged for words he could not summon. My daughter-in-law's face burned red, her hand trembling near her untouched glass. Rotation of angles. I looked not only at them, but at the cousins, the nieces, the in-laws, each face reflected in my weary eyes. This house will not be ruled by deceit. If you choose her path, then know you have chosen against me. If you choose mine, then stand with the truth, even if it burns. The words landed like a bell tolling midnight. Heavy, final, impossible to ignore. The table, once a place of family, had become a line in the sand. And as each pair of eyes shifted, choosing where to fall, the air grew tighter still, as though the walls themselves strained to contain what came next. The line I had drawn still pulsed in the air, as if the candlelight itself flickered differently on each face, depending on which side their heart leaned. My son stood frozen, his pride a shield cracking under the weight of silence. My daughter-in-law's hand hovered near her glass, her eyes darting, searching for an escape that no longer existed. Then a voice rose from the far end of the table, thin, wavering, but sharp as a nail on wood. It was Aunt May, my late wife's sister, who'd been watching quietly all evening, her hands folded neatly as though she were holding on to something heavier than cutlery. "I saw it," she said. Her words sliced through the tension. I saw her tilt the bottle when Max looked away. I thought my old eyes might be playing tricks. But now no. I know what I saw. Echo and break murmurs rippled down the table like falling dominoes colliding with gasps, then breaking again into a hush. My daughter-in-law's shoulders stiffened, her knuckles whitening on the linen. My son's head jerked toward his aunt, disbelief fighting with fear in his eyes. Arc variation, the rhythm shifted. Some leaned forward, eagerly hungry for clarity, while others leaned back, retreating into denial. The contrast was stark, each breath heavy enough to tip the balance of the night. I stepped into the moment with my own voice firm but not raised. Truth doesn't come from me alone. It lives in the eyes of those who have nothing to gain by speaking it. Aunt May carries no wealth in this fight. No inheritance, no claim. Her only inheritance is her conscience. Symbolic variety, her frail hand lifted from the table, trembling slightly, but in it she held her rosary, the beads glinting faintly in the candlelight. A silent testament, faith and truth were not to be sold or swapped. Rotation of angles. I looked at the younger cousins, their eyes darting between their parents, and me, confusion clouding them. "What lesson do you want tonight?" I asked them, my voice soft but deliberate. That deception feeds us, or that family stands when honesty holds it up. My son's lips parted, desperate for a defense, but none came. His wife's gaze darted between the glass and the door, as if measuring the shame that would follow whichever path she chose. And I felt the weight shift again. A chair scraped back, not in anger this time, but in solidarity. One of the nieces, barely in her 20s, whispered, "I believe him." Another voice followed, then another, until the balance tipped audibly. Echo and break their whispers rose into a rhythm, a wave that swelled, then broke against my son's silence. I breathed steady, letting their voices fill the hall. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't alone in defending the truth. And as I let the air steady itself again, I knew the climax was no longer distant. The storm had found its eye, and from here everything would be exposed. The rosary beads in Aunt May's hand were still trembling when my son slammed his palm against the table. The plates rattled silverware, clinked, and conversation snapped shut like a slammed door. His face flushed crimson, and his voice cracked as he shouted, "This is a setup. Father has poisoned this night with lies." "You think it's her fault? No. It's his plan to humiliate us." Echo and break the hall erupted, half gasps, half silence, then broke again into whispers bouncing off the wooden walls. My daughter-in-law seized his arm, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted everywhere but toward the glass that still sat untouched in front of me, the liquid inside catching the candlelight like a shard of gilt. Arc variation. His fury was fast, loud, burning, but my reply came slow, deliberate, each word spaced like measured footsteps across a courtroom floor. "If it is a setup, son," I said, my voice steady, "then drink from the glass yourself. Show us all." The symbolic weight fell heavy. The glass, so ordinary a vessel, now an icon of intent, stood between us like a challenge no one could ignore. My son's jaw tightened. He reached, hesitated, fingers hovering above the stem. His breathing quickened, audible in the hush. Rotation of angles. My eyes swept across the family. The younger cousins leaned forward, hope and horror mingling in their gaze. My brother-in-law crossed his arms, skeptical, but watching closely. Aunt May closed her eyes, lips moving soundlessly in prayer. Then came the break. My son recoiled, knocking his chair backward with a crash. "I don't have to prove anything to you," he barked. His words tried to hold power, but the sound of the chair clattering on the floor betrayed him, anger collapsing into fear. Small emotions collided in the air, My niece's trembling hand covering her mouth, the sharp intake of breath from my sister, the low disbelieving chuckle from an uncle who had said nothing all evening. Every detail tightened the noose, and I felt it in my bones, the tide turning. The very silence of those who once doubted now leaned heavy on my son. Even the crackle of the candle seemed louder, the wax dripping down in uneven lines like time itself, marking his guilt. Public climax gathered force. My voice rose, not in rage, but in a clear, ringing tone. Family, I said, sweeping the table with my gaze, truth doesn't need me to defend it anymore. It speaks in fear, in silence, in the refusal to lift a glass. The words hung echoing, and when they broke, the room was no longer on his side. The chair still lay on the floor where my son had knocked it down. No one moved to pick it up. The echo of his outburst still clung to the walls, but it was already beginning to fray like smoke thinning in open air. I didn't need to say more. The silence was saying it for me. Then came a new sound, slow footsteps across the tiled floor. The waiter, a young man with dark hair falling into his eyes, shifted uneasily at the doorway. He had been invisible until now, blending into the background of service, but at that moment every head turned toward him. He cleared his throat, the clink of the tray in his trembling hands louder than any shout. His voice cracked but then steadied. I saw her. I saw your daughter-in-law pour something into the glass when she thought no one was watching. Echo and break the family erupted. Gasps collided with mutters. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. A cousin whispered too loudly. I knew it, and then silence again, heavy as stone, broken only by the faint hum of the ceiling fan above. Arc variation, the waiter's confession came quick and sharp, but the room's reaction dragged long drawn out like people trying to catch up with the weight of the truth. My daughter-in-law's face drained of color, her hand flying to her chest as though she'd been struck. Symbolic variety surged the glass, still untouched the chair, still toppled the rosary beads, still clutched in Aunt May's hand. 3 symbols in one room, each marking guilt, chaos, and prayer. I shifted my gaze, rotation of angles, catching the looks of every witness. My brother-in-law leaned forward, suspicion confirmed in his eyes. My niece whispered to her sister, their hands trembling against the linen tablecloth. Even the waiter looked both terrified and relieved, like a man who had dropped a heavy stone he'd carried too long. I spoke then, first person, letting the air carry my words. You wanted me to be small tonight, to drink, to falter, to become a story you could twist. But truth has a way of finding its voice even through a waiter, even through silence, even through fear. My daughter-in-law's lips parted, searching for denial, but no words came. My son's face hardened, his jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed him, darting to her with a flicker of betrayal he could no longer hide. The family had turned. The room itself had turned. And I stood in the center of it, not as the accused, but as the one holding the weight of truth in my hands. Public climax landed with finality. The truth was no longer a suspicion, no longer just mine. It had been spoken, witnessed, echoed. And in that moment, the scheme that had been meant to break me began to break them instead. The waiter's words still rang in the air like a struck bell. My daughter-in-law's chair scraped back, her silk dress brushing against the floor as she shot up her hand, pointing like an arrow at the boy who had spoken. You lie, she cried, her voice breaking into the silence. You're just a servant who would believe you over me, Echo. And break the accusation came sharp and loud, then fractured into silence again. The only sound, the faint tinkle of a wine glass trembling in her grip. Her words had landed, but not the way she hoped. A servant's voice may be small, but truth once spoken is hard to bury. Arc variation. The tempo shifted her outburst, jagged and fast, but the family's response dragged slow, deliberate, heavy. One by one, eyes turned away from her and toward me, then back to her again, weighing her desperation like a coin found counterfeit. Symbolic variety filled the room, the untouched glass still gleaming on the table like a witness. No one could silence the spilled beads still clutched in Aunt May's hand. The fallen chair still sprawled as if frozen in accusation. She tried again, her tone pitched higher, wobbling under its own weight. Why would I ever harm you? She asked, eyes darting, breath uneven. Her hands trembled as she tried to set her glass back down. but the bass clinked too loudly against the crystal plate beneath, betraying the storm inside. Rotation of angles. The cousins leaned forward, whispering to one another, their faces pale. My brother-in-law shook his head, his voice low, but clear. No one acts that desperate unless they're hiding something. Even the waiter, still clutching his tray, lifted his chin with newfound courage, no longer shrinking back. And then I stepped into the silence, first person, my voice steady as a gavel. You say a servant lies, then let the glass speak. I reached for it, slow, deliberate, lifting the wine with the whole table watching. This drink carries more weight than your words. And if you are as innocent as you claim, I paused, holding the glass out toward her, then you may drink it yourself. Public climax cracked open, the family gasped, whispers like wind rushing through the hall. Her face froze, the color draining her lips pressed tight. She didn't move. She didn't reach. She didn't drink. And in that stillness, the silence itself condemned her louder than any voice could. Her silence, after I lifted the glass, stretched like a rope pulled taut, threatening to snap. The family stared, the glow of the chandelier flickering across tense faces. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Echo and break the stillness shattered when my son finally spoke. His chair screeched as he pushed back, his voice sharp, a blade cutting through the quiet stop, accusing her, "You've turned this whole dinner into a trial." Then softer, almost broken, he muttered, "You always find a way to humiliate me." Arc variation. The room slowed again, his anger landing heavy, but behind it was something raw. His eyes darted not toward me, but toward the untouched glass, toward the woman he defended. The hesitation was small, but it rippled through everyone watching. Symbolic variety filled the scene, her jeweled hand gripping his sleeve like chains, the glint of the wine glass poised between us like a verdict, and the ledger of loyalty written across his sweating brow. His defense of her was not born of certainty, but of desperation, the last wall cracking. "I built this family's respect," I said, my voice measured but rising with each word, with sweat, with long nights, with a promise never to shame the name your mother carried with pride. I pointed toward the table where her photo still stood, candles burning low. "And now you choose to shield deceit, while she watches from that frame." Rotation of angles. The cousin's whispers turned into a murmur. Then a wave, "He's right, look at her. Why won't she drink?" A niece covered her mouth, gasping. An uncle shook his head, eyes narrowed at my son. The chorus was no longer mine alone. He trembled. His hand twitched as though he wanted to reach for the glass himself, then stopped halfway. His wife's eyes widened, pulling him closer, whispering something sharp in his ear. But he flinched, recoiling as if her words burned. First person climax. I leaned in, my voice, low, steady, but cutting clear across the table. "If you truly believe in her innocence, son, then drink. Drink in her place. Prove to them all that your loyalty is not blindness." The gasp that followed wasn't mine to carry, it belonged to the hall. He froze, sweat glistening on his temple, torn between blood and betrayal, between truth and the trap he'd bound himself to. And in that unbearable pause, the fracture in him showed too small to heal, too deep to hide. The silence after my challenge pressed on the room like a weight no one could lift. My son's hand hovered above the stem of the glass, trembling, then fell back to his side. The echo and break came not in his words, but in hers. "No!" She snapped, the sound brittle, sharp as a plate cracking. Her jeweled fingers clawed at his sleeve, dragging him back toward his chair. "He doesn't need to prove anything to you." Arc variation. The hall shifted again, voices low, shuffling feet, the clink of silverware against plates abandoned mid-meal. People leaned closer, their breath filling the space where her confidence should have been. The quiet was no longer safety for her. It was judgment wrapping around her throat. Symbolic variety spread across the table. The untouched wine glass glowed under the chandelier like a trap lit by fire. The framed photograph of my late wife flickered with candlelight, her calm gaze watching this storm. My son's sweat-stained collar was the battlefield where love and loyalty collided. "She has nothing to hide," I said, rising to my feet now, my voice filling the hall. My rough hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "Then why shield her from a simple drink? Why does she cling to your arm as if drowning in her own secret rotation of angles?" The cousins leaned in, whispering too loud to be whispers anymore. She's scared. Look at her face. A nephew's fork clattered to the floor. Even the youngest grandchild turned wide-eyed, sensing the storm in the adult's silence. Her mask cracked. Panic danced in her eyes as she scanned the room, searching for sympathy, finding only suspicion. You all think her voice faltered. She tried again, louder, shriller. You all think I'd harm me after everything. I leaned forward, letting the stillness return, then broke it with the force of first-person truth. Yes, I said, because I saw your hand. Because every soul in this hall saw your hand. And no lie can turn their eyes blind again. The murmurs swelled into a wave. My son recoiled from her grip, his face pale, his lips parting as if he had finally seen her with the same eyes the rest of us did. She stood cornered, her words slipping through her fingers like sand, and the wineglass gleamed between us, the symbol of a scheme unraveling. In that moment, her power wasn't shattered by me, it was swallowed by the silence of those who no longer believed her. The hall had turned into a theater of breathless watchers. Every cough, every shuffle of feet felt like a drumbeat in the silence pressing on her. My son's hand slipped from her arm. At last the movement small, but it broke her like a hammer striking porcelain. Echo and break her protest came out jagged. You can't, you're twisting everything. The words tumbled fast, desperate, but the weight in the room drowned them. Arc variation shifted again, no longer whispers, but voices rising raw and unfiltered. Then let her drink it, someone said near the back. The call was blunt, without mercy. Another voice joined sharper. Yes. If it's just wine, let her drink it. Symbolic variety bloomed across the table. The untouched glass, glowing like an ember. The silver cutlery, now weapons of truth, as hands tapped them against plates, a rhythm of demand. The chandelier above swayed gently, throwing shards of light over her pale face, as if the room itself had judged her. Her eyes darted rotation of angles from cousin to uncle, from aunt to grandchild, but every gaze was a wall closing in. Even the youngest, whose innocence should have softened the scene, stared at her with unspoken confusion. Why won't she just drink? I rose fully, then the wooden chair scraping against the floor, the sound cutting through her excuses. This hall doesn't ask for proof from me, I said, voice low but steady. It asks for proof from you. One sip, and the whispers end. Micro-emotions tangled in her trembling hands, the way she clutched the tablecloth as though it might shield her, the twitch at her lip when the glass was pushed closer. My son stood frozen, sweat dripping from his temple, the last line of defense he could offer her now shattered by his silence. First person pierced the tension. I reached forward, my rough fingers brushing the stem of the glass, lifting it, feeling the cool weight of her intent. I set it gently before her. Drink, I said, or let the silence speak for you. The crowd hushed again. Her lips parted, but no sound came, only a shiver running down her spine, as if the room's judgment had already poisoned her. The glass remained untouched, yet the verdict rang louder than any toast. And in that stillness I felt the tide turn, not just against her, but against the son who let her hand move and said nothing. Her hand hovered above the glass, trembling like a leaf caught between wind and stillness. For a moment it seemed she might give in silence the whispers with a single sip. But then she recoiled, pushing the glass away as if it burned her skin. Echo and break, the motion echoed in the hall like a thunderclap, the break coming in gasps from every throat. Chairs creaked, forks clattered, and the stunned hush was pierced by murmurs that no one could contain. Arc variation surged. Voices swelled, overlapping, harsh with disbelief. Why won't she drink? One demanded. Another sharper still, because she knows what's inside. The rhythm of outrage rose like a wave, slamming again and again against her feeble denials. Symbolic variety bled into the scene. The glass, untouched, became more than crystal. It was judgment incarnate, clear as water, yet heavy as stone. The spilled drops from her earlier fumbles streaked across the white cloth like stains that could not be erased. Above, the chandelier's light fractured into shards, casting jagged patterns over her pale face, a mirror of the fracture tearing through the family itself. Her voice cracked, rotation of angles, pulling her words toward anyone who would listen. You're all against me. This is madness. She pointed at me, her finger shaking. He twisted it. He set me up. I stood slow and deliberate, my shadow stretching across the table, swallowing her frantic gestures. First person, I let my words fall steady. I didn't set you up. You set yourself up the moment you thought deception could live in this house. My son staggered forward, then his eyes darting between her and me, torn open by the crowd's stare. Micro-emotions traced his downfall, the twitch of his jaw, the sweat carving lines down his temple, the flicker of regret in his eyes when he realized he had gambled everything on her hand, and her hand had betrayed him. The hall turned tribunal. Uncles leaned forward, aunts whispered, cousins muttered. Even the children sensed it, the crack in the world where truth had poured in. All eyes converged on the glass, still sitting untouched its surface, gleaming like a blade catching light. I shifted it back toward her with the gentlest push, the stem sliding across the tablecloth, a sound so small it sliced through the storm. No one here will force you, I said, but the choice is plain drink or let your silence condemn you. Her hand stayed frozen in her lap, her lips pressed tight, her eyes wild with the weight of every gaze upon her. And in that refusal, louder than any confession, the hall understood. The verdict had been sealed not by poison, not by proof, but by her own fear. The silence after her refusal didn't last. It cracked open like ice, underweight, and into that crack poured voices, first whispers, then demands. Why won't she drink? What's she hiding? The family that had once clinked glasses in celebration now circled her with eyes sharp as knives. Echo and break surged, one voice sharp as a bell rang across the table. You tried to shame him. Then another broke through, you tried to poison him. Each echo made the air heavier until the room itself seemed to lean on her shoulders. But then the arc shifted. My son stood. His chair scraped the floor, a raw screech that turned every gaze toward him. His hands were fists knuckles white, but his voice trembled as he forced words through clenched teeth. Stop this madness. She didn't mean the sentence, fractured, dangling because he could not finish it. Angles rotated. From the elders at the head of the table, frowning with the weight of decades, to the younger cousins, wide-eyed and whispering, their eyes darted between the untouched glass and the man who claimed authority but suddenly looked like a boy drowning. Symbol piled upon symbol. The chandelier above swayed slightly, its light tilting, casting shadows across his face that looked like cracks splitting through stone. The untouched glass gleamed still, a silent accuser. And his hand, when it reached toward it, shook so violently that he drew it back as if scorched. I spoke, my voice carrying steady in the storm. First person, low and unyielding, you called this house yours. You claimed my work as if it had been built by your sweat. But tonight all can see you can't even carry the weight of your own silence. His eyes flashed at me, fury and shame battling behind them. You think you're a hero, don't you? His voice cracked. They follow you because they're blind. But this factory, this family, it needs me, not an old man clinging to ghosts. Gasps followed, some sharp, some mournful. His words hung in the air like a rope he had thrown around his own neck. Echo met break again. His defiance echoed. But the break came in the faces, turned away, the murmurs that no longer defended him, but condemned. Micro-emotions betrayed him further, the twitch in his lip, the sweat shining on his temple, the quiver in his shoulders, as if the truth was pressing him down. His wife stared at the untouched glass, her own mask shattering, and for the first time her hand slipped from his arm. The hall became tribunal once more. Uncles leaned back, aunts exchanged looks, cousins shook their heads. Even the youngest knew his words had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And in that moment, he stood utterly alone. The air quivered after his outburst, every breath in the room caught between anger and disbelief. Bridging from his collapse, I moved slowly the way a man does when he knows he carries the final card. The murmurs that had condemned him now fell quiet as they watched me reach for the leather satchel I had kept at my side all evening. The shift in rhythm was deliberate. Slow, deliberate gestures against the chaos of his crumbling pride. My fingers brushed the worn straps, the scent of old paper rising, as if history itself was about to step into the room. I placed the satchel on the table, the wood creaking under its weight, and slid out the thick handwritten ledger. Echo and break resonated again. His voice shrill, desperate, rushed in to fill the silence that's nothing but old number stories no one remembers. But the break came the instant I opened it, the inked lines shining under the chandelier's sway, the names of men and women who had given their lives to this factory recorded in my hand. Arc variation shifted upward, no longer whispers of suspicion, but rising breaths of awe. The family leaned forward, even those who had doubted me before, their eyes following my finger as it traced the columns of sweat and sacrifice. Wages paid from my pocket when the factory was sinking. Loans covered. Families kept fed. I lifted my head, and for the first time spoke with fire in first person. This is my sweat. This is my blood. And these pages, I raise the ledger high its edges, catching the light, are the real foundation of everything you boast about. Symbol after symbol erupted. The untouched glass still sat, gleaming silent proof of betrayal. The chandelier light flickered as if bowing to the truth. And the ledger itself, thick, worn, indestructible, became the sword none could deny. Angles rotated with precision. The camera of every gaze swung from me to the ledger to my son's pale face. His jaw slackened, his fists unclenched, and his body seemed to shrink inside the expensive suit he wore like stolen skin. Even the youngest cousins, once dazzled by his bravado, now stared at him with disappointment, too heavy for their years. Micro-emotions scattered like sparks the tremble in his hand as he reached forward, and then withdrew, the quiver in his lip, the tear he fought back but could not hide. His wife pressed her hand over her mouth, the sound of her muffled gasp breaking the last pretense of loyalty. And then, the public climax, I slammed the ledger shut. The sound cracked through the hall like a gavel. You claim my sweat as yours, I said, steady and cutting. Now let all see whose name is written in every line. Not yours. Never yours. The hall roared, not with chaos, but with a collective verdict. Applause, shouts, the pounding of fists against the table. The echo of justice itself. He staggered backward, his world unraveling with every cheer, while the ledger stood untouched, glowing with the authority of truth. The hall still thundered with applause, the echo rolling through the high beams like a storm that refused to pass. Yet in the middle of that storm stood my son, trembling but unwilling to bow. The applause broke against him like waves against a rock, but his eyes darted with desperation, searching for any piece of ground left to claim. The bridging came naturally out of triumph, grew defiance. He slammed his palm on the table, the crystal glasses rattling. You think ink on paper makes you king, he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of 100 eyes. This factory breathes because of me. These men and women stayed because of me, echo, and break unfolded once more. His echo of power, spoken too late, broke instantly when an old worker at the back rose to his feet. The man's voice carried the grit of years. You never came down to the floor. You never lifted a single crate. We stayed because of him. Others followed, voices layering, breaking his claim apart like glass under a hammer. Arc variation sharpened the rhythm, no longer the slow burn of revelation, but the quick tempo of a man's downfall. My son's hand shook as he reached for the ledger, trying to snatch it away. But I moved first. My rough worker's hand veins, marked with years of labor, pressed the book to my chest. No, son. You don't erase truth with greed. Symbolic variety bled through the scene, the wineglass still full, untouched, a mirror of temptation, unfulfilled. The chandelier's light bent down upon him, a spotlight now harsh, exposing. The ledger in my arms no longer looked like paper, but a weight, the burden of sacrifice he had never carried. Rotation of angles drew the room tight, his wife's face pale with shame, cousin's eyes wide with disgust, workers clapping harder, some even stamping their boots. From above, the hall seemed to tilt, pushing him toward a corner he could not escape. Then I spoke in first person, each word a nail in the coffin of pretense. You claimed my sweat. You claimed my name. But look at them. I pointed to the rows of faces, eyes gleaming with fire. They are the living proof. You cannot claim them. They do not stand with you. Micro-emotions etched themselves into the silence that followed. His jaw quivered. His fists opened, then closed again, useless. His breath came sharp, shallow, like a man drowning on dry land. A single tear traced down his cheek, not sorrow, but rage at a truth too large to fight. And then the public climax, he stumbled backward, knocking over his chair, the crash ringing like his final verdict. The hall erupted once more, but this time the applause carried no rhythm of support. It was the sound of a people casting him out. His last stand collapsed into ashes, while the ledger burned brighter than any jewel. The crash of the chair still lingered in the rafters, its echo a broken cry of defiance fading into nothing. Out of that silence, a new sound rose, not from one voice, but from many. It began as a murmur, the shuffle of boots, the clearing of throats. Then it grew into a chorus, each worker adding a note of memory, a testimony that pulled the truth tighter around my son like a net he could not break. Bridging lines formed naturally as downfall gave rise to their unity. An older woman, her hair streaked with silver, stepped forward. "I remember when the machines broke down and you stayed all night on the floor," she said, looking at me. "Not him. You." Her words hung like lanterns in the hall. Echo and break flowed again. My son tried to lift his hand to argue, but their voices drowned him. He gave us winter coal. He carried crates when our backs gave out. He signed paychecks even when profits were thin. Each voice echoed sacrifice, and each broke his illusion of ownership further. Arc variation shifted the rhythm, the scene swelled with the cadence of testimony, then slowed into the gravity of recognition. One by one they rose, a foreman wiping grease from his hands, a young worker with trembling lips, even the factory nurse who once patched my palms with bandages. Their voices overlapped, weaving a tapestry of loyalty stronger than ink. Symbolic variety punctuated the air. The wineglass on the table now seemed like poison abandoned untouched by fate. The ledger in my arms, heavy yet righteous, glowed under the chandelier, as though the very paper carried light. The fallen chair lay like a discarded crown, a symbol of authority unearned. Angles rotated, pulling the hall into focus from every direction. From the side, children of the workers peeked in wide-eyed, clutching their mothers' skirts. From the back, retired men leaned on their canes, nodding their silence as loud as any cheer. Overhead, the lights shimmered, bouncing on their faces, until the whole room seemed to shine with the reflection of shared truth. And then in the thick of it, I spoke in first person, again letting the hall feel the pulse of my heart. This factory was never mine alone. It belonged to every hand that bled within these walls. But my sweat was the first stone laid, the mortar binding it. That ledger holds the truth. Not a treasure for one man, but a story for all. Public climax landed when they surged forward, not in chaos, but in unity. Dozens of hands clapped in rhythm, stamping boots, until the walls shook. The hall itself became a drumbeat, a living verdict. My son shrank against the wall, small beneath the weight of a chorus he could not silence. The echo of their voices rose, until it no longer sounded like applause, but like justice itself rolling through the rafters out into the night air and into history. The applause still thundered when I raised my hand, and slowly the hall hushed, as though the very walls leaned forward to hear what would come next. Bridging lines connected the roar to the stillness. It was not an end, but a breath before the truth's final descent. My son's eyes darted between me and the crowd, his lips moving without words, as though he could still bargain with the silence. I held the ledger to my chest. The cracked spine pressed against my palm like the heartbeat of every year I had worked. My voice, when it came, was steady, carrying the weight of both defiance and grace. This ledger, I said, was never about profit. It was proof of sweat, of sacrifice, of trust. And tonight, it will find its rightful keeper. Echo and break struck again. My son stumbled forward, hand outstretched. "That's mine," but his words broke under the sharp reply of boots stomping men and women, shaking their heads, their chorus slicing his claim apart. "Not yours." The hall rang, "Never yours." Arc variation pulled the rhythm inward. My steps slowed as I crossed the floor, each footfall, deliberate, carrying the weight of decades. Faces turned to follow me, a sea of waiting eyes. some brimming with tears, others burning with long-held gratitude. Symbolic variety filled the space. The fallen chair remained untouched. The chandelier above glistened like truth made visible. The ledger in my hands now seemed less a book than a torch. I shifted my angle, turning not to the wall, not to my son, but to a young man who stood frozen near the front, my nephew, the quiet one who had stayed behind in nights of overtime, who once swept floors without complaint. His hands were calloused, his shoulders strong from labor unpraised. And yet when my gaze met his, he lowered his head as though unworthy of what he did not dare to expect. I spoke in first person, my heart beating through every word. I built this place not for a throne, but for a future. Let it be carried by the one who knows sweat, not only demand. Let it rest in hands that still believe in work. The hall leaned forward as I placed the ledger into his trembling grip. His fingers closed over it slowly as though he feared it might vanish. Gasps ran through the crowd, then cheers, not of rebellion but of renewal. Angles rotated again over my shoulder. I saw my son collapse into his seat, his face pale, his chest heaving with disbelief. From the side, workers embraced their voices, mixing with the pounding of feet on the wood floor. From above, the light bathed the nephew in a glow he had not sought, but now could not refuse. Public climax exploded as the room erupted. Boots stomped, hands clapped, voices shouted his name. The ledger, once my secret record, was lifted high, a symbol of truth, wrested from lies of inheritance, not by blood alone, but by worth. And in the heart of that storm, I closed my eyes for a moment. The sound was not noise. It was vindication. It was justice made flesh. It was the proof that what was stolen in arrogance had been restored in honor. When the hall finally emptied, the echoes of the cheers still clung to the walls like the last glow of sunset refusing to surrender. I walked slowly through the quiet factory floor, the scent of oil and steel lingering in the air, my footsteps sounding louder than they ever had before. The ledger was gone from my hands, now resting with someone who would guard it with the reverence it deserved. I found myself back in the small office where the old clock ticked on the wall and the desk lamp cast its soft circle of light. On the shelf where dust had gathered through years of neglect stood the picture of my wife. Her smile, gentle, unwavering, met my tired eyes. I sat down, resting both hands on the desk, and whispered into the stillness, "It's done." They know now. They finally know. The quiet was not empty, it was full. Full of every sacrifice, every dawn spent working, every night spent planning, every scar pressed into my hands. It was the kind of silence that healed, the kind that told me the storm had passed. I leaned back, listening to the hum of the factory settling into rest. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. My son's betrayal had stung deep, but it no longer owned me. What endured was not bitterness, but clarity. The truth had spoken louder than pride, and it had been heard. I thought of the workers' faces, their eyes shining, their applause pounding like a heartbeat in unison. I thought of the nephew holding the ledger, his hand shaking not with greed but with responsibility. And I thought of the way justice, when it comes, never arrives with trumpets. It arrives in quiet conviction, in the slow and steady turning of the world toward what is right. I whispered one last time to the photograph, the words, barely leaving my lips, "Now they know." And with that, the story finds its rest. Thank you, dear listeners, for walking this journey with me. Your time, your presence, and your hearts are the reason these stories live beyond the page. May health and peace stay with you, and may your families always find warmth in one another. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.